The first thing you learn when you're dirt poor isn't how to save money. It's how to lie. You lie to your teachers about why you didn't have lunch. You lie to your friends about why they can't come over. And eventually, you start lying to yourself. I grew up in a town that felt like it was dying in slow motion. Everything was covered in this thin layer of gray dust from the local foundry. My dad, Silas, worked there for 30 years. He didn't just work there, he smelled like the place. Even after a shower, he smelled like hot metal and old grease. It's a scent that sticks to your soul. I remember one night specifically. We were sitting in the kitchen. The light bulb was humming, that annoying, high-pitched buzz that tells you it's about to pop. My dad was sitting there with a pile of change on the table. He wasn't composing a symphony. He was just a tired, broken man trying to figure out if we had enough for the electric bill or if we were going to spend another week in the dark. He looked at me and his eyes were bloodshot. "Elias," he said, his voice sounding like he'd been swallowing glass. "Sometimes the world just doesn't give you enough, no matter how hard you bite." I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt disgusted. I hated the way he looked. I hated the way he accepted it. I hated that he was okay with being a good man who couldn't even buy his kid a pair of shoes that didn't have holes in the soles. The breaking point? It wasn't some grand tragedy. It was a trip to the grocery store. We were standing in line, and my dad was doing that thing he always did, counting pennies to pay for bread and milk. The line was long. People were staring. I could feel the heat rising in my neck. This guy behind us, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that probably cost more than our car, checked his watch and made a noise. A pathetic, judgmental little grunt. My dad's hands started shaking. He dropped a handful of coins, and they scattered everywhere. He actually got down on his knees to pick them up off the dirty floor. People had to step back. He looked like a beggar. I didn't help him. I stood there and watched my own father crawl on the floor for 10 cents while a stranger looked at him like he was a stray dog. In that moment, I didn't see a father. I saw a warning. I walked out of that store before he even stood up. I didn't care about the milk. I didn't care about him. I just knew one thing. I would never, ever be that man. I was going to get out of that gray town. I was going to make so much money that I'd never have to look at a penny again, and I didn't care who I had to become to make it happen. That was the day I stopped being a kid and started being a machine. And machines don't have families. They just have goals. Getting out of that town felt like escaping a sinking ship. I got a scholarship to a big university, and the day I left, I didn't even look back in the rearview mirror. My mom was crying on the porch, and my dad just stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. I didn't feel sad. I felt relieved. When I got to campus, I realized very quickly that I was the trashy kid. My clothes were wrong, my accent was wrong, and I had no idea how to talk to people who had never worried about a light bill. So, I did what I had to do. I killed the old Elias. I spent every waking hour in the library, not because I loved learning, but because I was obsessed with winning. I practiced speaking in front of a mirror until I sounded like a news anchor, clean, polished, and empty. I worked 3 jobs just so I could buy one decent suit. I wanted people to look at me and see a success story, not a kid from a town that smelled like rust. By the time I graduated and landed a job at a top firm in the city, the transformation was complete. I was making more money in a month than my dad made in a year. I remember getting my first big paycheck. I sat in my apartment, which had actual heating and a view of the skyline, and I just stared at the numbers. I had done it. I was the guy in the suit now. But then the phone would ring. "Elias? It's Mom. Your father's back has been acting up again. We were wondering if you were coming down for the holidays." I'd look at my expensive watch, then at the sleek, white walls of my apartment. Hearing her voice felt like a heavy anchor dragging me back into the mud. I'd make up an excuse. I'm too busy, Mom. There's a big deal closing. I'll send you some extra cash, okay? I started sending checks every month. It made me feel like I was paying my debt. I told myself I was being a good son because I was providing for them, but the truth was much uglier. I was paying them to stay away. I was paying them so I wouldn't have to look at my dad's dirty fingernails or hear about the neighbor's boring problems. I was ashamed of them. I'd go to these high-end dinners with my colleagues, drinking wine that cost $500 a bottle, and I'd pray that nobody ever asked me where I grew up. If they did, I'd give a vague answer about upstate and change the subject. I had spent my whole life promising I'd save my parents from poverty. But now that I had the money, I realized I didn't want to save them. I wanted to forget they existed. I had climbed the ladder so fast that I forgot I was supposed to be pulling them up with me. Instead, I was just kicking the ladder away. 5 years went by like a blur of glass and steel. I wasn't just making it, I was winning. I had the corner office, the car that drove itself, and a girlfriend who didn't know a thing about where I came from. To her, and to everyone else, I was a self-made man with a private past. I thought I was happy. I had a routine. Every month, I'd set a reminder on my phone, send check to Mom and Dad. I'd click a button, $5,000 would disappear from my account, and I'd feel this smug sense of relief. I told myself, look at you, Elias. You're a hero. You ended the poverty. But money is a funny thing. It doesn't just buy you stuff, it builds a wall. And every check I sent was another brick in that wall. The phone calls got shorter. My mom would try to tell me about the local grocery store closing down or how my dad's old friend had passed away. I'd listen with one ear while scrolling through stock market news on my laptop. Her life sounded like a boring, slow-motion movie. I didn't care about the gossip. I didn't care about the town. I just wanted to hear that they got the money so I could hang up and get back to my real life. One summer, I finally went back. My girlfriend was away on a trip, and I had a rare weekend off. I drove my luxury SUV into that gray town, and I felt like a foreign invader. The car felt too big for the narrow, cracked streets. The air felt heavy. I walked into my parents' house, and the first thing that hit me wasn't love, it was the smell. It was that old, familiar smell of fried onions and damp carpets. I stood in the living room in my $300 t-shirt, looking at the plastic covers on the sofa and the dusty TV. Elias, look at you, my mom cried, hugging me. She felt so thin, like she was made of paper. My dad came in from the backyard. He looked older. A lot older. His hair was gone, his back was hunched, and his hands, they were still stained. That black Foundry grease was etched into his skin forever. He reached out to shake my hand, and I actually hesitated. I didn't want that grease on my clean skin. You look like $1 million, son, he said, his voice a raspy whisper. We sat down for dinner. My mom had made the favorites, heavy, greasy food that I hadn't eaten in years. I sat there, picking at a piece of meat, looking at the way my dad ate. He chewed loudly. He used his bread to wipe the plate. He looked like a peasant. I felt this hot, ugly wave of embarrassment. I kept thinking, what if my colleagues saw me here? What if they saw this house? I felt like I was back in that grocery store line, watching him crawl for pennies. So, Elias, my dad said, oblivious to my mood. That money you send, it's a lot. You're sure you're doing okay? You're not working yourself to death. I'm fine, Dad, I snapped. I make more in a week than this house is worth. Just enjoy the money, okay? Buy a new couch. Hire a cleaner. You don't have to live like this anymore. The room went quiet. My dad looked at the duct tape on the arm of his chair, then back at me. We like our life, Elias. We just like seeing you. Well, seeing me is hard, I said, standing up. I couldn't take it anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in. I have a life now. A big life. I can't keep coming back here to sit in the dust. I left that night. I didn't even stay for breakfast. As I drove away, I looked at the house in the rearview mirror and felt a sense of power. I had outgrown them. I had escaped. I didn't call for 3 months after that. I sent the checks. I sent even more money, hoping it would drown out the guilt. I thought I was being a provider. I didn't realize I was just becoming a stranger with a deep pocket. I had officially ended the poverty. But I had also ended the family. And the worst part? I didn't even care. The call came at 3:14 a.m. In my world, a 3 a.m. phone call usually means a market in Tokyo just crashed or a deal in London went south. I reached for my phone, already thinking about spreadsheets and damage control. But when I saw the word home on the screen, my heart didn't race. It just felt heavy, like a stone dropping into a well. I didn't even say hello. I just waited. Elias. It was my mom. Her voice was shaking, but she wasn't sobbing. She sounded tired, the kind of tired that goes all the way down to the bone. He's gone. Your father. He didn't wake up. I sat up in my king-sized bed, surrounded by Egyptian cotton and expensive silence. I looked at the digital clock on my nightstand. 3:15 a.m. My dad was gone. The man who had spent 30 years in a foundry so I could go to a school where people didn't smell like rust was just erased. I should have cried. I should have felt like my world was ending. But honestly, I just felt numb. I felt like a robot that had been programmed to forget how to feel anything that wasn't related to a profit margin. The drive back to my hometown was the longest 6 hours of my life. I was driving a car that cost more than most of the houses on my old street. As I pulled into the neighborhood, the contrast was disgusting. My car was so shiny and black it looked like a hole in the universe. Everything else was gray, peeling, and broken. I walked into the house, and it was exactly the same. The same old furniture, the same crack in the hallway ceiling, the same smell of fried food. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table. She looked like a ghost. I hugged her, and she felt like she was made of twigs. "He was so proud of you, Elias," she whispered into my shoulder. "He told everyone at the diner about your big office. He used to keep your business card in his shirt pocket, right over his heart." That was a gut punch. I hadn't seen the man in months. I hadn't called him in weeks. But there he was, walking around with my name in his pocket like it was some kind of holy relic. The funeral was small. Just a few old guys from the Foundry and some neighbors who looked at me like I was a billionaire alien. I stood there in my tailored black suit, looking like a statue. I didn't feel like a son. I felt like a spectator. As they lowered the casket into the ground, I looked at the other men there. They had dirt under their fingernails and cheap, ill-fitting suits. They looked like my dad. And then I looked at myself. I looked perfect. I looked successful. But as the dirt hit the wood, I realized something that made my stomach turn. I had spent my whole life running away from my father's life. I had spent millions of dollars to make sure I wasn't like him. And now that he was gone, I realized I didn't actually know who I was without him to run away from. I had escaped the poverty, sure. But I was standing at my father's grave, realized I was the poorest man in the cemetery. I had a bank account full of numbers and a heart that was completely empty. I went back to the house to pack up some of his things. I just wanted to get it over with and get back to the city. I didn't know that the real story was hiding in the one place I had always hated to look. The house was dead quiet. My mom had finally fallen asleep in the back room, and I was left alone in the living room, surrounded by boxes. I just wanted to grab his old watch, maybe a couple of photos, and get the hell out of there. This place made me feel like I was suffocating. I sat down in my dad's old armchair. It was a piece of junk, brown corduroy, worn out at the knees, and one leg was propped up by a folded piece of cardboard because it was uneven. Growing up, I hated this chair. To me, It was the ultimate symbol of being poor. It was a hand-me-down that should have been in a dumpster 20 years ago. As I leaned back, I felt something hard under the cushion. I reached down, thinking it was a lost remote or some old coins. Instead, I pulled out a small, metal tin, the kind people keep old buttons or sewing kits in. Inside wasn't buttons. It was a cheap, spiral-bound notebook. I opened it, expecting to see a grocery list or some old phone numbers. But as I flipped through the pages, my heart stopped. It was a ledger. My dad's handwriting was messy, but the numbers were clear. Every single check I had sent over the last 10 years was listed there. May 1st, $5,000. June 1st, $5,000. But there were no subtotals for rent. No subtotals for the new roof I told them to buy. No subtotals for the medical bills. At the bottom of the last page, there was a final number. It was nearly $600,000. I sat there, staring at that number in a dusty, dark house with peeling wallpaper. They hadn't spent a single cent. They had lived in this freezing house, eating cheap food and wearing old clothes, while $500,000 sat in a bank account. A small, yellowed piece of paper fell out from the back of the notebook. It was a note from my dad. "Elias," it said, "the city is a big, cold place. We see it on the news all the time. Companies firing people, markets crashing, lives being ruined in a day. We were so proud of you for making it out, but we were also scared. We knew that if the world ever turned its back on you, you'd have nowhere to go. So we kept it all. Every penny you sent is waiting for you, just in case you ever need to come home and start over. We didn't need the money, son. We just needed to know you were safe." I looked around the room. I looked at the duct tape on the arm of the chair. I looked at the old, stained carpet. My dad hadn't been a failure. He wasn't a peasant who didn't know how to live. He was a man who had lived in poverty for 10 more years just so I could have a safety net he never had. While I was busy being embarrassed of him, he was busy protecting me. While I was sending him money to buy his silence, he was saving that same money to buy my future. I looked at my hands, my clean, soft, expensive hands. I realized that the black grease I was so afraid of wasn't a stain of shame. It was a stain of sacrifice. I had escaped poverty, but I had turned into a man who knew the price of everything and the value of absolutely nothing. I had $500,000 in a bank account and millions more in the city, but standing in that quiet, empty house, I felt like the most pathetic person on earth. I didn't leave that night. I stayed in that broken chair until the sun came up, holding that cheap notebook like it was the most expensive thing I'd ever owned. I had finally ended the poverty. But I realized, far too late, that I was the only one who was truly poor.